Folks in Dry Creek liked to say the mayor's house, perched high on the ridge, shone brighter than any place for miles. But those who lived close enough to hear the nightly shouting knew the truth. That big white house was lit not by grace, but by anger. And at the center of it all stood Natalie. Natalie was 24, slight as a sapling, bent too many seasons by the wind. She was the mayor's blood, but not his daughter, not the way the world counted such things. She had come into the world through the wrong mother, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. Mayor Ben Whitfield never let her forget it. Neither did his wife, Marion, nor their son, Charles. Every morning, before the sun scraped its first line of gold across the plains, Natalie was already awake, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her back stiff from carrying water up and down the long hallway. Marion would sit at the dining room table, a grand walnut thing, polished to a shine-sipping hot coffee, as Natalie worked. The woman had a face carved sharp as a hatchet blade, and her words cut just as deep. "Look at you," Marion would sneer, tapping the rim of her cup, "skinny as a fence rail and just as useless. No wonder your real mama ran off. Who could stomach raising the likes of you? If it weren't for Ben's pity, you'd be starving in a ditch." Natalie kept her eyes down. She'd learned years ago that answering back only meant more trouble, and trouble usually came in the form of Charles. Charles Whitfield was 30, broad-shouldered, and mean in the casual way of men who have never been punished for anything. He'd swagger into the kitchen at noon, still smelling of whiskey, though he hadn't gone to bed until near dawn. Every time he laid eyes on Natalie, a crooked smile would crawl up his face. "Well, look who's still breathing," he'd mutter, grabbing her arm just hard enough to bruise. "Don't think the world owes you air, bastard girl." Sometimes he'd shove her against the counter. Sometimes he'd yank her hair, just to see her flinch. Marion never stopped him. Mayor Ben never cared enough to notice. Ben Whitfield, for his part, never raised his voice, but the quiet was its own kind of violence. He still looked like the powerful man he had always been. Tall, broad in the shoulders, gray hair kept short. Boots shined to perfection. But inside, he'd grown hollow. The town thought he was grieving the recent loss of a business partner. Natalie knew better. The man was rotting from the shame of her existence, and the resentment had come to define him. Every night, when he returned from the courthouse or the saloon, he'd find some excuse to strike her a misplaced dish, a floor not mopped just right, a shirt not folded sharp enough. His hand, the same hand the town respected, left bruises up and down her ribs. "You should never have been born," he'd hiss, eyes cold as winter creek water. "You're the stain on my name." Natalie stopped crying years ago. Pain became a companion, familiar as the creak of the old stairs. But the steady ache had carved her down to bone. She no longer dreamed. She no longer hoped. She survived. Then came the evening everything cracked open. Charles had been gambling again, cards and whiskey out behind the livery stable. When he lost more money than he could pay, he staggered home looking for a way out. He found it the moment he burst into the parlor and saw Natalie dusting the shelves. "There," he shouted, pointing at her with a trembling hand. "It was her. I saw her taking money from Pa's drawer this morning. She's been stealing for months, I bet. Little rat's probably got a stash somewhere." Natalie froze. Her duster slipped from her hand. "I didn't," she whispered. "Charles, you know I didn't." But Marion stormed across the room before she finished. "You lying little tramp," she shrieked, striking Natalie across the face so hard the woman fell to her knees. "Ben, get in here." The mayor appeared in the doorway, his jaw tight, his eyes dark. "She's been stealing," Charles insisted. "I caught her. Saw her with my own eyes." Ben didn't ask how or when. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't even look at Charles. He looked only at Natalie. "You ungrateful curse," he growled. Then he hit her. Not once, not twice, but again and again until the room spun and the taste of blood filled her mouth. Marion shouted insults, Charles kicked her ribs, and Ben dragged her by the arm all the way to the front porch. "You're done here," he said, shoving her into the cold night. "Get out of my house and take your filth with you." Charles threw her small bundle of clothes into the yard. Marion slammed the door behind them. Natalie tried to stand, but her legs buckled. The sky above the ridge was fading to a soft pink, and snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting down like ash. She crawled toward the road, her breath rasping in the cold. By the time she reached the fence line, she could no longer feel her fingers. She collapsed in the snow beside the old cottonwood tree. Her vision dimmed. Her heartbeat slowed. And she thought, with a strange calmness, maybe this is the best mercy the world will ever offer me. But fate had other ideas. A wagon rattled down the road, a covered wagon, painted the deep blue of a night ski. Holding the reins was a woman in widow's black, her face worn by years of grief. Agnes Whitmore, known across the valley for her charity and her sorrow, pulled her horse to a stop. "Oh, dear Lord," she murmured, climbing down. She knelt beside Natalie, brushing snow from the young woman's face. "You poor child," she whispered. "What have they done to you?" Natalie's lips trembled. Her voice barely rose above the wind. "Everything." Agnes wrapped her coat around the shivering girl and lifted her with surprising strength. "You're coming with me," she said softly. "No one deserves to freeze alone on a night like this." And with that single act of mercy, Natalie's life, broken, battered, nearly ended, shifted onto a new and unknown path. Agnes Whitmore's wagon rolled slowly down the snowy road toward her ranch, the wheels creaking under the cold. She kept one arm wrapped around Natalie the whole way, steadying the young woman as though afraid she might vanish if she loosened her grip. Natalie leaned against her, shivering beneath the widow's heavy wool coat. Every jolt of the wagon sent a thread of pain through her ribs. "Easy now," Agnes murmured. "We're almost home." Home. The word hit Natalie harder than the winter wind. She hadn't belonged anywhere, not truly, for as long as she could remember. By the time they reached Whitmore Ranch, the ski had turned the color of pewter. The property stretched nearly 200 acres, but much of it lay silent and unused. Once, Agnes and her husband had turned this place into a thriving cattle operation. Once, there had been warm lights in every window and laughter drifting across the yard. But her husband had died 6 winters back, and her only son 3 years after that. The ranch had grown quiet, like a house holding its breath. Agnes helped Natalie down from the wagon and guided her toward the wide front porch. The young woman hesitated at the bottom step. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I ain't. I mean, I'm not." "You are cold," Agnes interrupted gently. "You are hurt. That's all that matters." She opened the door and led Natalie into a long entry hall, warmed by a roaring stove. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and soap clean, comforting scents that wrapped around Natalie like a soft blanket. Agnes called out, "Anna, fetch warm water and the salve jar." A stout housekeeper with a gray braid hurried in, taking one look at Natalie before clucking her tongue sympathetically. "Oh, the poor thing," Anna said. "Bring her to the sitting room, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll fetch everything." The sitting room was large, lined with shelves of old books and framed photographs. A faded portrait of a young man, Agnes's son, hung above the fireplace. Natalie stared at it a moment, feeling an ache behind her ribs that wasn't from the beating. Agnes eased her onto a cushioned settee. "You must be starving," the widow said. "Let me get you something to eat." She returned with a bowl of hot stew, thick, hearty, rich with potatoes and beef. Natalie stared at it, her hands trembling. She had never been allowed to eat at the same table as her family. Never been served anything warm unless Marion needed leftovers cleared. I'll spill it, Natalie whispered. Agnes sat beside her. Then we'll clean it up. Don't fret. Natalie took a small spoonful. Then another. Warmth spread down her throat into her chest. To her own mortification, tears began to slide down her cheeks. Agnes didn't try to stop them. She simply rested a gentle hand on the girl's back until the sobs eased. After Anna helped clean and bandage the bruises, Natalie was shown to a guest room upstairs. It wasn't grand by Whitmore standards, but to her, it felt like the kind of place where safe memories might be born. A soft quilt on the bed, a lamp glowing warm and steady, a window overlooking the cottonwoods. For the first time in years, someone had made a bed for her. That night, Natalie lay on her back staring at the ceiling. She listened to the wind brushing snow against the window pane. No shouting, no footsteps storming down the hall, no threat of a hand raised against her. She cried again, quietly, helplessly, and fell asleep long past midnight. The days that followed were slow, gentle, and unfamiliar. Agnes gave her light chores, nothing like the grueling work she'd known before, just dusting a shelf or helping Anna fold linens. Sometimes Agnes simply asked her to sit by the fire and rest. "You've carried too much for too long," the widow would say. "Let the burden ease a little." Natalie hardly knew what to do with such kindness. She moved softly, afraid the floorboards might wake someone. She spoke in a whisper, as though her voice itself were a trespass. It took a full week before Agnes coaxed more than a handful of words out of her. One afternoon, while mending a tear in one of Agnes's shawls, Natalie finally asked, Why did you bring me here? You didn't even know me." Agnes looked up from her knitting, her eyes warm but rimmed with the old sorrow she carried. "I didn't need to know you," she answered. "I knew what it was to hurt. When I saw you lying in that snow, well, child, it stirred something into me I thought had died with my family." She set her knitting aside and leaned closer. "You deserved a hand reaching toward you, not striking you." Natalie lowered her gaze, overwhelmed. Agnes continued, voice quiet as wind through wheat. "You remind me a bit of my daughter-in-law. She was gentle like you. Lost her too young, just like I lost my boy." For a moment, the widow's gaze drifted toward the portrait above the fireplace downstairs. "Grief hollows out a house," she whispered, "but maybe helping another soul fills it a little again." After that talk, something softened inside Natalie. She began to speak more, smile more. She even dared to laugh once, soft, startled, but real, when Anna told a story about a goat getting into the pantry. But the biggest change came when Agnes brought out a stack of old primers and set them on the table. "Let's teach you your letters," she said gently. "No woman ought to go through life blind to words." Natalie stared at the books as though they were lanterns in the dark. "I don't know if I can learn," she murmured. "Nonsense, Anonymous," Agnes replied. "You've survived worse than the alphabet." And so, in the warm quiet of the Whitmore parlor, Natalie traced letters with trembling fingers. A, B, C, C. She whispered them under her breath until they felt like old friends. It was during one of these lessons that Agnes said something that changed everything. "My nephew Thomas will be visiting soon." Natalie looked up. "Who's Thomas?" "A good man," Agnes replied, "but a lonely one, same as you." There was something unreadable in the widow's voice, hope perhaps, or the quiet stirring of an idea. Natalie didn't ask more, but the name stayed with her long after she crawled into bed that night. Thomas. She wondered what kind of man he was. She wondered why Agnes had spoken his name the way she did. She did not yet know that his arrival would turn her quiet refuge into the beginning of a new life, a life she had never dared imagine. Thomas Whitehorse arrived at Whitmore Ranch on a gray, wind-bitten morning, the kind of morning when the chill settled deep into the bones of the earth. Agnes had heard the hoofbeats long before Natalie did, and she rose from the breakfast table with a faint smile, softening the lines of her face. "That'll be Thomas," she said, as though naming a gentle storm moving in from the horizon. Natalie felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard the name whispered through the house for days now. Sometimes Agnes spoke it with pride, sometimes with quiet longing, as though the young man was a thread connecting her to what family she had left. Natalie had no family, no one who wanted her. She didn't know what to make of someone who was wanted that deeply faithfully. A few moments later, the front door opened, letting in a gust of cold wind and a tall figure wrapped in a buffalo hide coat. He stepped inside with a quiet that felt intentional, as though he did not wish to disturb anything that did not belong to him. Thomas was Apache, though his mother had been half white. His features carried the sharp, chiseled beauty of his people. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, dark eyes that missed nothing. His black hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, streaked with a few early strands of gray that made him look older than 30. But what struck Natalie most was the stillness about him, a kind of peaceful gravity. "Thomas," Agnes greeted warmly, reaching up to lay a hand on his arm. "It's good to have you home." "Good to see you, Auntie," he replied, voice low and steady. "I came as soon as your letter reached the trading post." His eyes drifted to Natalie, then quiet, assessing, but not in the way men usually looked at her. There was no judgment in it, no hunger, no cruelty. Simply observation, like he was taking in a new ridgeline or the lay of a river. "Natalie," Agnes said, "this is Thomas Whitehorse, my nephew by marriage. Thomas, this is Miss Natalie Hartwell. She's staying with us for now." Thomas nodded. "Ma'am." Natalie pressed her hands together to hide their trembling. "Sir." Agnes smiled in that small but knowing way she had. "Why don't we sit for coffee? It's too cold for long greetings." They gathered at the oak table. Agnes poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. Thomas did not speak much. He never had, Agnes had said. He answered questions simply, offered comments only when they mattered, and seemed to listen more than most people cared to. Natalie learned that he'd been working in the hills past Red Snake Ridge, digging for silver on a claim inherited from his mother's side. He lived in a small cabin he built himself, cooked his own meals, fixed his own tools, hunted his own meat. He kept few possessions, rode a single good horse, slept under the stars when the weather allowed. "A man can lose himself if he stays too close to what the world expects," he said quietly, staring into his coffee. "I prefer the silence." Agnes tilted her head. "You prefer it, or you hide in it." Natalie stiffened at the boldness of the question, but Thomas didn't flinch. He just gave a slow, tired smile, the kind that carried the weight of years. "I suppose it's both," he admitted. It was then Natalie learned something she hadn't known. Thomas had been married once. His wife, a gentle woman named Alona, had died 4 years prior from lung fever. The grief had carved him in ways no one could see at a distance, but became clear the closer you drew. A shadow lived behind his eyes, a quiet ache that had settled in like winter fog. Agnes reached across the table and gently patted his hand. "You deserve more than loneliness, Thomas." His eyes lifted, meeting hers. "Maybe. But I want a life that's honest, simple, shared with someone who don't care about land or money or the bloodlines of my people. I want a woman who stands by heart, not comfort." Natalie felt her cheeks warm. She looked away quickly. Agnes didn't. "Well," the widow said in a tone that pretended to be casual, "perhaps there's someone already under my roof who fits that description." Thomas gave her a quiet, almost amused look. "Auntie." Natalie's heart thudded painfully, and she stood too fast. "Who should finish the linens?" she murmured. She moved toward the hallway, embarrassment prickling her skin. But before she disappeared, she heard Agnes say softly behind her, "She's a good girl, Thomas." one who's been given every reason to fear the world, yet she still rises each morning, trying to be gentle with it. Thomas didn't reply, not right away. But something unspoken passed between him and Agnes's small agreement, an understanding carved from remembrance and hope. Later that afternoon, Natalie stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug when she noticed Thomas repairing a bridle strap near the stable. He worked with practiced motions, his hands steady despite the cold. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You're afraid of me." Natalie nearly dropped the rug. "I'm not. It's all right." He tightened the leather buckle. "I've seen fear before. I know what causes it." She swallowed. "I don't mean to be rude." "You're not." He sat back on his heels, finally meeting her gaze. "I don't want anything from you, Natalie. Not now. Not ever. Unless you choose it." That last line settled deep inside her, warmer than the fire in Agnes's parlor. She nodded faintly. "I don't understand anything anymore." "Then let it unfold," he said. "No one's chasing you here." His words lingered long after she returned inside. That night, Agnes sat by the fire knitting, Thomas at her side whittling a small cedar carving. Natalie watched them from the doorway. For a long while, two people bound not by pain alone, but by the quiet courage of having walked through it. For the first time, she wondered if the world still held a place for her, and whether this quiet, steady man might somehow be part of it. The first snowmelt came early that year, slipping down from the roof of the Whitmore house in thin silver streams. The air softened, and the cottonwoods stirred with the hint of spring. With the change of season came a conversation Natalie never expected. It was after supper. The table cleared, the lamps turned down low. Agnes folded her napkin and looked toward Thomas, who was oiling the worn handle of his pickaxe. "Thomas," she began gently, "have you given any thought to what we discussed?" Natalie froze where she stood by the stove, though the question hadn't been directed at her. Thomas didn't look up, but his voice came steady. "I have." "And?" Agnes asked. He glanced toward Natalie, then back at the axe handle, his thumb running over the grain of the wood. "I need to live a life that's my own," he said. "Away from the tribe's expectations, away from the past." He paused. "But I also need to know I'm building something that matters." Natalie's pulse fluttered like a quail in tall grass. Agnes nodded slowly, knowingly. "You can't build anything alone forever." His eyes lifted again, fixing on Natalie this time. "If she's willing, I'd like her to come with me. To the cabin, not as a servant, not as someone beholden, just to see if she can find peace there." Natalie felt the room tilt. Her hands went cold. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Agnes rose, walked to her, and cupped her cheek in a gentle palm. "Child, no one is asking you to decide your whole future, just to take a step toward it." Thomas stood then, not approaching, just giving his words room in the quiet. "No promises," he said softly. "No demands. If you want to leave at any time, I'll bring you back here myself. I just want to see if you can breathe easier under a simpler skelty." It was the kindest offer Natalie had ever received. And so, the next morning, with Agnes packing a small trunk of clothes, linens, and food staples, Natalie climbed onto the back of Thomas's horse. She looked at the Whitmore house one last time, its windows glowing warm in the rising sun, and whispered a thank you. She wasn't sure she had the voice to speak aloud. Agnes waved from the porch, her eyes glistening. "Be gentle with yourself, child." "And Thomas." "I know," he said awfully. "I will." They rode out, the hooves kicking up thawing snow, the prairie stretching wide and open. The cabin sat in a long valley, 12 miles west of Dry Creek, far enough that the wind seemed to carry a different sound there, softer, less burdened. It wasn't much to look at. A single-room structure of rough-cut logs. A stone chimney leaning slightly to one side. A narrow porch with a rocking chair that had seen better years. Smoke lifted lazily from the chimney when Thomas lit the fire. "This is it," he said simply. "Ain't grand. But it's honest." To Natalie, it was more beautiful than any place she had ever seen. Not because of the structure, but because nothing in it carried the memory of raised hands or hateful eyes. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and tobacco. A handmade bed sat against the wall, covered with a patchwork quilt faded from years of use. A small wood stove simmered in the corner. On a shelf above it were jars of dried beans, jerky, and herbs gathered from the hills. "It's small," Thomas admitted, removing his coat. "But it's safe. Safe." That word again, the one she was still learning how to trust. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll sleep on the cot outside or roll out a blanket by the stove." Natalie shook her head quickly. "No, Thomas, I don't want to put you out." "It's no trouble." His voice remained gentle but firm. "You don't owe me nothing. I want that clear." Natalie nodded, though her throat tightened. She'd lived her whole life feeling like she owed the world everything, her silence, her labor, her body if someone demanded it. The idea that nothing was required of her left her both relieved and deeply unsettled. Days passed in a rhythm she had never known before. Morning started with the crackle of the stove and the chill air slipping through the cabin walls. Thomas would hand her a tin cup of warm milk or coffee before stepping out to check his traps or head toward the mine. Sometimes he returned by midday, other times near sundown with dust on his clothes and a tired ache in his bones. Natalie cooked simple meals, cornbread, beans, rabbit stew when Thomas's traps were lucky, dried apple slices soaked soft in warm water. She swept the floors, mended his shirts, and kept the fire alive. Not because she was ordered to, but because the task steadied her. In the afternoons, when the light was soft through the cabin window, Thomas taught her new words. They practiced reading a hand-me-down primer Agnes had given her. "You're learning fast," he told her one evening. Natalie smiled, shy and proud. "I didn't know I could." "You can," he said softly. "All you ever needed was a chance." Their eyes met a brief moment, warm as the fire between them, and then he gently looked away, giving the moment space. As the days warmed, they began to laugh more. Once, Thomas tripped on a loose board, muttering under his breath in Apache, and Natalie burst into giggles she hadn't heard from herself since childhood. Another day, she burned a batch of cornbread, and Thomas ate it anyway, insisting it added character. They lived quietly, but not silently. And in that quiet, something tender began to root itself between them. Still, Thomas held himself back, always respectful, always steady, because this wasn't a relationship born of choosing each other freely. Not yet. Not truly. One evening, as orange dusk settled behind the hills, he stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the sky. "You all right?" Natalie asked softly. He nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, then saw, "About whether this life is good for you. Whether you're here because you want it, or because it's the only door that opened." Natalie stepped closer, the boards creaking under her feet. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, "but I know I'm safer here than I've ever been." Thomas looked at her then, not with possession, not with expectation, but with a quiet gratitude that struck deeper than anything else. "Then we'll keep building this life slow," he said, "piece by piece. No rush, no demands." Natalie nodded. For the first time, she believed him. Late spring settled over the valley, like a soft blanket, warm enough to coax wildflowers from the ground, gentle enough that the creek behind the cabin ran clear, instead of roaring with snowmelt. For a time, Life felt almost ordinary for Natalie and Thomas. She baked bread with a little sourdough starter Agnes had given her. He repaired the cabin roof, humming a quiet tune from his childhood. Their days carried the small comforts of people learning to breathe again. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, easily broken by the sound of hooves. It began one afternoon when Thomas was out hunting mule deer along the ridgeline. Natalie knelt by the porch, scrubbing a small tin pot with sand from the creek. The breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed pine. She was humming under her breath, a habit that had come back slowly, like a bird too timid to land when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow at first, then louder. Natalie froze, the tin pot slipping from her hands and rolling onto the dirt. She stood and wiped her palms on her apron, eyes fixed on the distant bend of the trail. A plume of dust rose in the sunlight. 2 riders, maybe 3. No 4. Her stomach dropped. No one came this far west unless they meant trouble or carried it with them. As the riders drew close, she recognized the tall frame of the man in front, the broad shoulders wrapped in a coat too fine for ranch work. Ben Hargreaves, Meyer of Dry Creek, wealthy cattleman, man whose word alone could tilt a jury or ruin a man's good name. And behind him, like shadows from a nightmare, rode her stepmother Greta and her half-brother Cole. Natalie stumbled backward until her spine hit the cabin wall. Ben reined in his horse, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He brushed dust from his coat, turned toward her, and offered a smile that never warmed his eyes. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this a surprise?" Greta descended from her horse with a sour expression. Her lips tightened, as though she'd just bitten into a spoiled apple. Cole slid from the saddle last, swaggering like he still held something over here. Even though his eyes were sunken, his clothes rumpled, and he smelled faintly of whiskey. Natalie forced words out through her tightening throat. What are you doing out here?" Ben took a step closer. "Come now, girl. After all these years, is that how you greet your father's old friend?" Natalie clenched her hands behind her back to stop them shaking. "My father's wealthy friend," she corrected quietly. "The friend who turned a blind eye whenever I came to town bruised." Greta scoffed, still dramatic as ever. "Good Lord, child. You act like we beat you half to death." "You did," Natalie whispered. Greta's smile sharpened. "And you survived. Be grateful." Ben shot Greta a warning glance. He preferred cruelty with smoother edges, then turned back to Natalie. "I'm not here to argue you," he said. "We came because your family is in trouble." Cole spat into the dirt. "Thanks to you, little rat." Natalie flinched. Ben continued, his tone oiled and practiced. "Your father's debts have caught up with him. The ranch is failing. Creditors are swarming. And your brother," he tilted his head toward Cole, "hasn't exactly helped matters." Cole bristled. "I told you I'd win it back. I just needed one more hand." Greta slapped the back of his head. "One more hand is what ruined us, you fool." Ben raised a hand, silencing them. "Point is, the family needs saving. And the only way out is through you." Natalie's throat tightened. "What does that mean?" A new smile, calm, decisive, poisonous, spread across his face. "I intend to marry you, Natalie." The world seemed to tilt. "No," she choked. "No, I won't." Greta rolled her eyes. "As if you get a choice. Ben's offering you a future, a fine house, stability. You should be thanking him." Cole stepped forward, jabbing a finger toward her. "You owe us. For all the food you ate. For the roof over your head. You think that came free? Father's ruined because of you." Natalie felt herself shrinking, the same way she had shrunk under their roof for 25 long years. But something new steadied her, spinning a memory of warm evenings in the cabin, of Thomas's steady voice saying, "You don't owe me nothing. a life she tasted for the first time. She lifted her chin. I'm not going back. Ben exhaled through his nose, amused. This isn't up for debate. You'll pack your things and come quietly, or... A sharp click rang through the clearing, a rifle being cocked. Every head turned. Thomas stood at the edge of the yard, coat dusted with pine needles, his hunting rifle leveled steady as a fence post. His face, usually calm as still water, held a storm. Or what? He asked coldly. Ben's men shifted uneasily. Greta yanked her shawl tighter. Cole instinctively stepped back. Thomas strode forward, boots heavy against the dirt, his dark eyes burning with a fury Natalie had never seen. You come to my land, he growled, and threaten the woman under my roof? You're either very brave or very stupid. Ben lifted both hands in a gesture of mock peace. Now, Thomas, no need for dramatics. We're simply bringing back what belongs to her family. She doesn't belong to you, Thomas snapped. Greta barked a laugh. She'll belong to Ben soon enough. Thomas's jaw tightened until the muscles quivered. She's free to choose, and she chose not to go. Ben's smile thinned. She will go, with or without your approval. I've already filed the marriage notice with the county clerk. The ceremony will take place in 3 days. Natalie turned pale. Thomas lowered his rifle just enough to speak, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. You're not taking her. Ben smirked. You think you can stand against the law? Against men who answer to me? Greta leaned forward in her saddle with a sneer. Let's see how brave you are, once we bring a sheriff and a warrant. The riders turned and galloped off, dust trailing behind them, like the tail of a storm. Silence fell. Natalie sagged against the porch rail, trembling. Thomas finally lowered the rifle, breathing hard. They won't stop, he murmured. Natalie's voice shook. What do we do? Thomas looked toward the horizon, where Cece still lingered. We prepare, he said, and when the time comes, I won't let them take you. The wind rose across the valley, carrying with it the first dark omen of the days to come. The church bell in Dry Creek rang out across the dusty streets, its heavy toll echoing like a warning through the valley. Folks gathered in their best coats and polished boots, whispering behind gloved hands as they filled the pews. A wedding day always stirred a town, but this one rattled folks in a way they couldn't quite name. Ben Hargreaves stood at the altar in a crisp black suit, smug as a man, convinced the world bent to his will. Greta dabbed her eyes dramatically with a handkerchief, proud of the marriage she expected would save her family from ruin. Cole slumped beside her, smelling faintly of whiskey, irritated he had to remain sober long enough to witness the affair. The only one missing was the bride. Natalie sat in a back room of the church, staring into a cracked mirror, her hands trembling around a bouquet of pale sagebrush. Someone had dressed her in a white gown, simple lace sleeves, a faded ribbon around the waist, but her eyes looked hollow, like the color had been drained from her soul. A woman she didn't know whispered, "It's time, dear." Natalie didn't answer. Her heart felt like a trapped bird beating itself against her ribs. She thought of Tomas's steady voice, his quiet laugh, the warmth in his hands when he poured her morning coffee. She thought of the cabin, the sound of the creek behind it, the life they'd begun to weave together, fragile and humble but real. The church doors opened. Cold air swept in. And she rose because she was pushed, not because she chose. Inside the sanctuary, the preacher cleared his throat and lifted his Bible. We gather today. The doors at the front of the church burst open with a thunderous crack. Women screamed. Men jumped to their feet. A horse reared in the doorway, its hooves striking sparks on the stone threshold. Atop it sat Thomas, wind-torn and fierce, eyes blazing with a determination that swallowed the room whole. Dust streaked his coat, and the rifle slung across his back looked ready for war. Ben's face contorted. "That Apache devil!" he roared. "Sheriff, stop him!" But the sheriff had taken one look at Thomas barreling into the church on horseback and quietly stepped behind a pew, deciding wisely that this wasn't his battle. Thomas reached down, arm outstretched. "Natalie," he shouted, "come with me." For a heartbeat, the entire church froze. Natalie stared at him, her escape, her truth, her beginning, and something inside her cracked open. She dropped the bouquet. It fell silently onto the wooden floor. She lifted her skirt and ran. Greta screamed curses. Cole lunged but tripped over the hem of a pew. Ben charged down the aisle, fury twisting his features. But Natalie was faster. Hope had a way of sharpening a woman's feet. Thomas leaned low from the saddle, grabbed her wrist and pulled her up behind him in a single fluid motion. She wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse turned sharply. "Close your eyes," he whispered. She did. Thomas kicked hard. The horse shot forward, hooves pounding like thunder, carrying them straight through the church doors as shouts erupted behind them. Bullets were fired, missing wide. The horse flew across the open ground, mane whipping in the wind. Natalie held tighter, her face pressed against Thomas's back, feeling the strength in him, strength she had learned to trust. Behind them came Ben's howl. "After them! Don't let them get away!" But his men were clumsy, scrambling to mount, disorganized as a pack of coyotes tripping over each other. Thomas knew the terrain better than any of them. He cut across a frozen creek bed, veered west toward a narrow ravine where the snowdrifts hid their tracks. Within minutes, the sounds of pursuit faded into nothing but wind. Natalie finally opened her eyes. "You came," she whispered. Thomas slowed the horse, breath steadying, voice low with emotion. "Did you ever doubt it?" She shook her head, tears streaking down her cheeks. I thought they'd take me forever." "Not while I draw breath," he said. "Not while this land still answers to the brave." She leaned into him, her tears warming in the dry winter wind. "Where do we go now?" He pointed toward the open plains, golden grass rising in waves that glimmered under the late sun. "Somewhere no ballot box or badge can touch us," he said softly. "Somewhere we build our own life, on our own terms." Natalie exhaled. Long and trembling, a release of 25 years of fear. She looked out at the endless horizon and felt for the first time that the world was large enough for her dreams. They settled miles west of the settlement line, beyond any railroad or ranch boundary. It was a quiet stretch of prairie with good water, clean air, and enough timber to build a home. Thomas shaped the land with patience. Natalie shaped it with tenderness. Seasons passed. They planted rows of corn and kept hens under a lean-to shed. Thomas hunted elk in the high ranges. Natalie learned to read newspapers and books beside the fire. They built a cradle from juniper wood and filled the house with soft laughter. When their first child, a bright-eyed girl, arrived in the early chill of winter, Thomas held her with a wonder that softened every hard memory he carried. Natalie named the baby Hope, because it was hope that had carried her out of darkness, and hope that had ridden through the church doors that day. At night, when the world was still, Thomas would whisper to Natalie, "No one owns you. No one ever will again." And she would answer, peaceful and merry, "I belong only to the life we made, and to the man who gave me a home when I had none." Out on the prairie, beneath skies wider than any sorrow, they lived as they were always meant to, free, cherished, and unafraid. In the quiet stretch of prairie they claimed as home, Natalie and Thomas learned that love like the open West was wide enough to heal even the deepest scars. Their days settled into a gentle peace, their nights warmed by the laughter of their growing family, proving that freedom is sweetest when shared with the one who never lets go. If you enjoyed this story, please hit subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can keep creating more tales for you. Thank you all for listening.